When I first came to the legislature to cover it, I was essentially covering events. And then I got bored with it because it seemed like I was covering the same type of events over and over again, the same subject matter. And I was. But then when you began to figure out what you're actually covering here is the sociology of the legislature, how you analyze the system, how the system is working. I had an editor one time who told me, and my master's degree is in government, he said, you're somewhat different than most reporters. And I said, how's that? And he said, well, most reporters, look at things as individual, or many reporters look at things as individual things. He said, you tend to look at it systematically. And I think that when you realize that you're covering how a person can affect the system and how the system can affect a person, then I think your role becomes much more instructive. The real evaluation of a legislator is how many votes he or she can influence. That there are some people who are loud and obnoxious and control one vote, and that's their own. But they can't bring anybody with them. Now, there are others who can bring along some people. I just wrote a column here recently about to incoming legislators, tell them that this is not as simple as they think. There is so much, it's impossible to pay attention to it all. And so the result is that you develop a sort of an informal buddy system where on so-and-so vote having to do with Health and Human Services, I know that Joe is on that committee and has paid a lot of attention to it, and I pretty much agree with what he does, and so I'll look over to him and he'll be telling me, vote aye or vote no on this. And I'll do it just because I know him and I trust him and I trust his judgment. And in that area which he's been studying and I haven't. I remember when a lobbyist friend of mine and a former legislator, when the Republicans took over the U.S. House of Representatives in 1994 in those elections, I said, what do you think? And he said, dog catches car. And this one is dog catches bus, because you've got a supermajority of Republicans. 101 out of the 150 members are Republicans, and possibly 102nd one will be if a recount or if an appeal of one district in Austin switches from a Democrat to a Republican. Now, what that means is that, they literally can do anything if they are all united, which is another question. But if they're all united, they don't need the Democrats. They can just run right past them. I don't think it's ever been, this grim. And back in the mid-'80s, during the oil bust, when oil dropped, below $9 a barrel or something like that, and Texas was still a very oil-dependent economy at that time, it was really tough. And they wound up, I remember the Republican governor at that time, Bill Clements, had said he wouldn't approve any tax bill that increased taxes more than $2.9 billion. And then Lieutenant Governor Bill Hobby and then House Speaker Gib Lewis went over to the mansion and told him, we've got to do this $5.7 billion tax increase, or we're going to have to shut down a bunch of schools and universities and things of that nature. And Hobby told me later, he said that, when he left the mansion, he didn't know what Clements was going to decide. And Clements, to his credit, acquiesced in that tax increase and kept funding things. Now, I don't think that would happen in the current climate. There are a significant number of people in the legislature who have signed that Grover Norquist anti-tax pledge. We're not going to vote for any new taxes. Well, we're at kind of a crisis point in that regard, because there are some services that people are used to that simply are not going to be cut or ought not to be cut. I was told that there was one state university and there were in an area where there had been some Tea Party folks elected, and one state university's budgeting department was meeting with them, and it had to do with a medical school. At some point in there, the budget official said, and then we have to do this with Medicaid. And one of the Tea Party people said, well, we're going to shut down Medicaid. And so the guy just closed his book and said, we don't need to talk anymore because that's what funds this medical school. The question will be, it's one thing to say, well, we're not going to raise taxes. It's another thing to say we're going to throw your granny out of the nursing home because 2/3 of the people that are getting Medicaid money are senior citizens. There's been a kind of a continuing argument through the years that the lieutenant governor is perhaps who presides over the Senate, who gets to choose who will chair the committees, who's on the committees, which senators get recognized to put bills on the floor, which bills go to what committees, and has control over half the legislative budget board, who's on it in addition to himself. That he is more powerful than the governor. There's never been a she lieutenant governor. But I think the governor, and particularly one that's been there as long as this one has, by now Perry has appointed every person that's been appointed to any appointive office and many judicial offices. I think he's appointed a majority of the supposedly elective Texas Supreme Court, and now he's in reappointment of some of these people. He's been there for 10 years, and when you've been around that long, then your control gets pretty widespread. Now, the lieutenant governors in the past, there have been some that have been quite powerful. Bob Bullock, who my friend and co-author Jim Henderson and I wrote a book about, the former lieutenant governor. He had great power, but part of his power stemmed from the fact that before becoming lieutenant governor, he'd been the state controller for 16 years and around state government a lot before that. And the result of that was that he knew the state government, and by virtue of being controller, the budget like the back of his hand. He'd also had about 2,500 people under his employ at any one time. So by the time, and he trained them very well. So by the time he became lieutenant governor, he had like 5,000 Manchurian candidates scattered all over state government, not just all over Austin, but all over the state. And the result of that was that when he took his hand off the Bible, it just sort of turned the key on all those minions that he had out there, and all those loyalties and debts and so forth. And he had this instant network to help him do what he was trying to do as lieutenant governor. No one before or since has had that kind of power. Somebody once said, several years ago, it may have been when Lyndon Johnson was president, said, if you can understand politics in Texas, you can do it anywhere. Lloyd Benson, the late former longtime United States Senator, was fond of saying, in Texas we call politics a contact sport. And as the second most populous state in the country, the decisions that we make here and the things that we do here have an impact. And the people that we have coming up through our political system, George W. Bush, Lyndon Johnson, Sam Rayburn, some real giants of politics who have come up through the Texas system. So it makes a difference what we do here. I counted up the other day, and I think there are a dozen current members of the Texas's 32 members in Congress who were legislators, Texas legislators, before they went to Congress.